Well, welcome back to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And we are continuing in the series on EBT, food stamps, SNAP programs. And we're continuing to talk about this issue because it's in the news, and it has been in the news for the last few weeks because of the government shutdown. There has been a temporary interruption in SNAP EBT payments over the last couple weeks to 42 million people in the United States. And I talked about in the past how that is an outrageous number of people who are on the government dole for free food. That is outrageous. In our country, in our modern, prosperous country of the United States, we have 42 million people who are getting free government food. That is terrible, outrageous. That is a scandal. That is an embarrassment. That is a humiliation of the democratic system that we operate under. That is something that the Founding Fathers could not have even conceived, that the government of the United States would be feeding millions and millions of people at some point in the future. They never could have even comprehended it. They would totally object to government being used in this way. This is not the way governments are supposed to be run. We see in the Bible, for example, in Romans 13, we hear and see a description of the basic government purpose, and the purpose of the government is to punish the evildoers. It's supposed to be there to maintain a civil society. It is not to be there to meet our every needs. And people are using the government today. Politicians are encouraging them to vote for every single entitlement program you can imagine, from housing, from food, from healthcare, transportation, cash allotments, just giving people money. That happens because of the government welfare programs that are now currently being operated. And that's why I am in favor of reforming or totally eliminating many or most of these programs, because they are totally destroying our country, and the character of people and the citizens' virtues are going down as the government expands and becomes more of a big socialist government. But let's talk more about some of the concrete realities happening in the United States now. And again, I'm using the Detroit News as a jumping off spot in order to look at this problem. It says here, in a week without SNAP, Americans missed meals and skipped bills. So the propaganda from the left mainstream media is flowing hot and heavy. They're claiming that Americans missed meals and skipped bills. They're trying to paint this as a crisis in America because the government is not giving people free money and free food. And that is totally false. If every single dime from the SNAP program never reached any of these welfare SNAP recipients for the whole month, no one would die. No one would starve. There would be so many different means by which these people got fed that there may not have been anybody who actually had to get physically hungry. There are soup kitchens, and there are local churches, and there are family members and friends who would pitch together and make sure that nobody starved. And so this whole idea that Americans are starving because the government hasn't fed them their meals and that people are skipping paying bills, well, that actually could be true, but that happens all the time. In a normally functioning family, when you have something happen that comes up unexpected, you could have a car repair bill that comes in that you weren't expecting, or some kind of emergency in the family. For example, the dishwasher goes out and you had to get a repair of the dishwasher, and that drew funds from your budget, and so you can't spend as much on, say, paying off your cable bill. And so the cable bill is due and it passed due, and then now you're delinquent on your cable bill. Okay? So delaying that payment, that kind of thing happens all the time in a normal family. So just because someone skipped a payment on a particular bill is not a crisis, because it happens all the time. And yet the propaganda machinery is trying to say people are dying of starvation, they're missing their meals, they're hungry, and they have to go to bed hungry, and they've skipped paying bills. Well, okay, they've skipped paying bills, but nobody is dying because of the SNAP controversy right now. At least nobody has been reported dead as a result of not getting a meal because the government didn't feed them. In the nation's largest cities, and in the smallest towns, from its public housing projects to its community college campuses, Americans are struggling to fill pantries and dinner plates. Yeah, this community college campus situation here is also something that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, but there are actually college campuses who encourage students, yes, students, studying in college, to go on food stamps. One of the most famous examples of this was during the scandalous tenure of Kwame Kilpatrick as the mayor of Detroit, before he was thrown into prison for all kinds of corruption. It was reported that during his college years, I think it was Michigan State where he attended, he had food stamps almost the entire time he was in college. So here's a college student from a fairly wealthy family. His mother was involved in politics, so they weren't poor. And yet, as a single individual, he could claim that his income was probably near zero and qualify for food stamps and get free food from the government while he's studying in college. And so I guess this article is trying to make reference to the fact that these college students who are on food stamps are really struggling to put food on their table. And yeah, college students struggle for a lot of things. I was a college student. I understand it's a struggle trying to pay the tuition and paying for any transportation needs you have, paying for books, and also buying food. And I had to struggle to put food on my table. And all college students have to struggle sometimes when they want to get an education. But they figure, okay, it's worth it that I go without for a while. And so I can live like that because I'm single and I don't have all kinds of responsibilities of a wife and children to feed. And so I can get by on very, very little. It may not be the most healthiest way to live, but it is a way to survive and achieve your goals, like getting through college. And then you get out in the job market and you begin to earn some more money, and then you can afford this and that and the other. So college students struggling to put food on their table, that is not a crisis. That is par for the course, as any college student can tell you, unless they've been coddled and spoiled. And like Kwame Kilpatrick, they just draw government money to pay for their food, free food. But that is not the purpose of government, to provide college students with free food. And this is one of the abuses of the SNAP program that needs to be reformed. It says, with the record-setting government shutdown dragging into its sixth week, more than 41 million people, that's actually 42 million people, most of whom are children, elderly, or disabled. That is not a proven fact. That is not a proven fact. That actually is a misleading statistic, and they're not actually even citing any authorities. They're just saying most are children, elderly, or disabled. No, that is not the case. Most of the people on SNAP, EBT, food stamps are not children and are not elderly or disabled. They are adults who actually can work and can provide for themselves and are not. And that's part of the abuse of the system, and that needs to be reformed. The perception they're trying to paint to you is that these 41, 42 million people, they're all children, and they're the elderly and infirmed and disabled, and we need to provide food for this segment because we are people with a heart and we care about the poor and that kind of thing. And yeah, we do, and we would want the money to go to them and only them. We don't want the money to go to the lazy deadbeats who sit around, or the welfare queens who have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids and collect thousands in food stamp money every month. We don't want the system abused. And it is being abused, and it's hurting families, it's hurting communities, and we don't want that. But the image is, oh, well, you're taking away the food for the children, the elderly, and disabled. No, we're saying we need to reform the system so they get the food, and these other people who are gaming the system do not get the food because they don't deserve the food, and we don't want to pay for their food when they can provide for themselves. They're still waiting for aid on the federal government's largest anti-hunger program, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, known as STAP. Anti-hunger. Here's another point. If it were truly an anti-hunger program, and the people on it were the people that you see, for example, in the third world nations where they're all skinny and emaciated, and they're starving to death, and they need this hungry food to ward off starvation, yes, the program would be justified. That is not the case. If you look at a lot of the recipients, maybe most of them, a majority of them, they are not hungry. In fact, they're overweight. They're overfed. The statistic that I heard was that the women on food stamps are 50 pounds overweight of the women who are not on food stamps in our nation. So you take a slice of the women in our country and you look at the women who are on food stamps and the women who are not on food stamps, and there is a 50-pound difference. Why? Because the food stamp women are 50 pounds overweight than the people not on food stamps. That means a lot of people who are not starving and are not actually hungry are abusing the system. They're just simply consuming too much food, and they're wasting money and at the same time growing dependent on the government, which is bad. Days of legal and political wrangling have whipsawed these families who are navigating a patchwork of public and private efforts to fill their gap. After initially refusing to use emergency funds to cover the shortfall, Trump administration signed Monday that it would send partial payments, an apparent concession to a pair of federal court orders. But the money has not come. On Thursday, one of the judges ordered the administration to fully fund the program by following day, criticizing the government for its delays. The Justice Department is appealing decision, according to court file. So you have the liberal leftist courts and judges, activist judges, the same kind that brought us Roe v. Wade in 1973, and the same kind of judges that have been doing the radical left's bidding for decades now. They're trying to get into the middle of the fight and force Trump to do things with money he doesn't have. You know, Congress gives money to the executive branch and then they disperse it. Congress has not authorized Trump to disperse any money for November. They have an emergency fund, but it can only partially fund SNAP. So Trump was going to partially fund SNAP, but then a liberal leftist judge came in and said, you have to fully fund it. Well, with what? So again, you have this political manipulation and propaganda. And here's this article. It says, families caught in the middle said they feel abandoned by their elected representatives. So again, this dependency that, oh, the government has to feed us. They don't care because it doesn't affect them, Sabrina said after she waited in hours-long line outside a food bank in Greeley, Colorado. They all should be put out in the day of life of normal, freaking, struggling people and see how it really is instead of sitting up there. No, they need to do their business, and then you need to do your business. And I would ask that, Sabrina, why don't you have this all worked out? Why are you looking for an emergency food supplemental assistance program? Why are you looking to the government to feed you? Why? Why don't you have this worked out in your own private life? Why do public tax dollars have to feed you? What is wrong with you in your life organizational planning? What is wrong with your budgeting? It is not a government problem that you have to put food on your table. It is your problem. So why are you blaming government officials for your problem? That's some questions that have to be asked. The unprecedented holdup, the first such interruption in the 61-year history of SNAP program, is hitting hard, hitting every corner of the countries, red states, blue states, areas, urban and rural. Families supporting children and people with disabilities are especially likely to rely on SNAP, along with Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic Americans. Yes, and there are genuine needy cases of people who it is wise for government, for citizens, taxpayers, to charitably fund food programs for them. There are certain segments of society, again, disabled people, the elderly, temporary emergencies for able-bodied people to find jobs or after they've been injured or some such situation. But the problem is that when you begin to allow people to stay on these temporary assistance programs long-term, then they become dependent. And then you have a welfare system and a welfare culture. In some of these major cities, like Detroit, the one where the Detroit News is based, there are entire blocks, there are entire sections of the city. 1/4 of Detroit citizens are on food stamps. This is generational welfare, generational poverty. This is a sickness in our culture. A society cannot survive when you have 1/4 of its citizens looking to the government to feed them. This is a basic human adult responsibility, and they're looking to the government to feed them, and they get indignant and resentful and angry when the government doesn't do something. They should be doing something for themselves. And they've had to go and look for food in the food banks and grocery stores and community churches and all kinds of other things. And that angers them, that they've had to work hard to try to feed themselves, instead of seeing it as, okay, I've got to step up and be an adult, and I have to provide for my children and for myself. And I'm not going to just rely on government handing me the food. It's been so easy to get this free government food that they've grown used to it. Oh, the government just puts it on my credit card, this little EBT card. He just, every month it shows up there. Just great. Yeah, that's too easy. You need to work for things to get by in life. And this dependency culture has to be reformed. It's not going to last long term. Washington Post reporters fanned out this week to food banks and grocery stores across the nation to document the personal impacts of the delay. Here are some of the people. A cosmology student in Illinois. A student, again, so they're talking about a student, college student, grade school student on food stamps. That shouldn't be. A mother of 4 in Colorado. Where's the father? Where's the father in the home? A barber in Houston. A barber? So he's working. So why is he on food stamps? A home health care aide in Virginia. So this person is working. Why are they on food stamps? Why are they on temporary assistance, supplemental, all trying to fill holes in Frank's social safety net that has become a fixture in the lives of many low-income Americans? Yeah, it's become a fixture, but is that a good thing? No, it's not. It's easier to get on these programs than to actually be removed from them. So then it talks about some of the sad stories of people. This woman here received $1,000 worth of food stamps each month. Wow. That's a lot of money. Yeah, when you're giving out that kind of money, free food every month, that's $12,000 for that mother is being given every year. $12,000 for food. A basic necessity of life, and the U.S. government is giving her that. Where is her husband? See, this kind of unaccountable living allows women to play fast and loose with getting pregnant, with having babies out of wedlock. You know, the feminist mantra, we don't need no man. Well, yeah, if the government is propping you up and paying for your life support, you don't need no man. But without government propping you up, you need a man, because how are you going to raise children? Especially this woman, she has 4 children. How are you going to raise 4 children without some kind of male support in the home, going out every morning, doing the job, bringing home the paycheck, and then buying the food? How can you do that without a man? You can't. And then it talks about a lot of the food bank are being hit, and it's putting a strain on them. Yes, because now instead of, again, supplementing food for people, lower income people, it is now trying to provide the bulk, full amount of food for them. And so they're crying about that, and they're saying, oh, it's... They're saying that I'm going to have to skip, but if the freeze stretched too long, she said, they might have to skip their gas and electric payments. Right? Because if you don't budget yourself correctly, you're going to have to delay payment. And again, that happens in the real world. That happens. I've had to delay payments on electricity. I've had to delay payments for gas before in my life. I've had to not pay bills before. This happens. When you run into a temporary situation where you don't have the money, you have to delay it somewhere. You have to prioritize. You have to budget. You have to do all those things. That's part of being an adult in the world. So it's nothing to cry about. It's just part of life. Here's a guy that's on food stamps, and they say he's a barber, and he's complaining about not having food stamps. Again, this man has to realize you shouldn't be on food stamps. You need to get off food stamps, stop being dependent, figure out a way to make ends meet, and not rely on the U.S. government and take money from the taxpayers. Again, the sense of entitlement, the sense of you need to give me money for my life, and if you don't, you're bad, you're evil. No. You need to take responsibility for your life. You need to work things out and plan and do things like an adult and make things work. Even if you have to work 2 jobs or whatever you have to do. That's what the man's role is. You have to do what you have to do. And you don't complain about it, you just do it, because that's life. And then he says that it made it a lot harder to feed my kids. It's time to go. I go out without so they can eat. And so my girl can work in the warehouse. His girl, so... maybe he's got a girlfriend. I don't know. It's a lot of times the whole family situation is messed up. His girlfriend, mother of his 2 youngest, just got a job working at a FedEx warehouse. Okay, that's what you do. That's what you have to do. But she won't get paid for another week. Okay, so there are all these situations and all these kind of circumstances that as adults, you don't complain about it, you don't grumble, you don't gripe, or you do it in private, but you don't blame the government for not feeding you free money for food. You don't blame the government. An Illinois student goes from class to food bank. Again, why is the student on SNAP? If you're a student that says that you have decided to forego working full-time or pursuing a job or career full-time to study, to gain knowledge, and you're willing to make the sacrifices. And that one of the sacrifices is it's difficult to make much money, and that's going to put strain on your food budget, but you have to do it because you're willing to make the sacrifice. Well, then you can't complain about the government not feeding you. And you shouldn't even be fed by the government to be a student. Again, this mentality of dependency and this entitlement has to be addressed. According to the 2024 Government Accountability Report, about 20% of all college students are on food stamps. 3.3 million college students. That should never be. Because as a college student, you're by definition most likely going to be broke and just barely squeaking by. So you're not a normal broke person in the sense that this is the way it's going to be. No, you're temporarily broke. You're deferring gratification, it's called, in order to actually get a nice job later on in life. So you're delaying your earnings and you're just barely squeaking by. But you shouldn't ask citizens and hardworking taxpayer Americans to pay for your food while you're making that choice for yourself. So here's a woman who actually is working and she's on food stamps. Why are you working on food stamps? Because it's available, because it's there, because the government will give it to me. That's basically what it boils down to. So there is a legitimate recipient for food stamps. Again, if you're disabled, if you are elderly, and there's no family or there's no situation for you to make it any other way, and you can't work, you're too old to work, too weak to work, or if you're temporarily in a situation where you're able-bodied, but you got laid off, and so you're struggling and you're trying to find a job, and you'll be back in the workforce and be able to make your own way, then yeah. But that's not what the typical food stamp recipient is. The typical food stamp recipient is abusing the system. They're using it as a way to supplement their lifestyle and buy other things that they wouldn't normally buy if they didn't have that food stamp money. But that's not good enough rationale to be on food stamps. It's an emergency. It's a last-ditch effort to try to feed someone who has done everything they could, but they couldn't get the food money. But this is being abused. It needs to be reformed or removed entirely. Well, we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ and Culture. God bless.